Is something good because God says it is, or does God say it's good because it is? This is probably one of the most fundamental things to understand about the nature of God and the nature of good, and ultimately the nature of reality. So, let me say that again. Is something good because God says it is, or does God say it's good because it is good? The distinction is, if God says something is good because it is good in and of itself, well then God isn't God, because there is a framework that's outside of God, and indeed transcends God, that God refers to justify his actions. So in this analysis, God becomes exactly like us. We have to refer to a framework around us, to the reality of whole nature, whatever that may be, in order to justify our actions. But God, on the other hand, can't do that, because if he refers to a framework outside of himself to justify his actions, well, he isn't the uncaused cause and he isn't the beginning. So, what we have to understand first of all is that something is good precisely and only because God says so, because God wills it to be good. There is no other reason. So, what happened in the Garden of Eden? When Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge, of good and evil, what did they gain? What ability did they gain then that they didn't have before? If it was the ability to discern between good and evil, as we conceive of discerning and knowledge in the Western world, and they only got that after eating of the tree of knowledge and didn't have it before, well then how can they be culpable, or how can their action of disobedience towards God have been bad? And also, if something is good because God wills it to be good, and Adam and Eve, when they ate of the tree of knowledge, gained a knowledge of that good and of that evil, and if you could put that into like a list and say that this is good and this is bad, and this is what God's willed, well then you've limited God then. There is an actual real limit to what God can do from then on. So in a sense, if that perception of the fall is true, that when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge, they gained a discernment, the ability to tell between good and evil, the ability to look at this thing which is good and evil and perceive it, but they couldn't perceive it before, then they gain a power over God, i.e., by them knowing what good and evil is, and good and evil being the will of God, they then make God a static thing within time where he can't change. Is that recording? Yeah. So, then, that can't possibly be true, because man, after being disobedient to God, couldn't possibly have gained a power over God that he didn't have before. In fact, man can never have a power over God. So this whole idea of Adam and Eve, after the fall, gaining a perception of this good and evil, which is outside them, and that then knowing good and evil and being able to use that to justify their decisions, that's my dog, they then gain a power over God, because they can see this static good and evil, which is supposed to be the will of God. So that can't possibly be the case. The knowledge that's spoken of in Genesis chapter 3 can't possibly mean knowledge in the way that we mean knowledge. And so, just to bring the Bible in here and to show what the Bible says on the subject, what actually happened in the Garden of Eden then? What did Adam and Eve gain from eating of the tree of knowledge, of good and evil? So first of all, was the snake lying when it came into Eve, and it said, "Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil"? So was the serpent lying at that point? First of all, was he lying about the death? Well, when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge, they didn't die a physical death. And going on, he says, "Your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Was he lying in that? Well, as a matter of fact, the serpent wasn't lying there, because later on, God himself says, "And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. So, what is this ability that God has? God says that man gained the ability, like God had, to know good and evil, whereas before he didn't have that ability. What does this mean? If we look at the situation of man and his relationship with God before the fall, the so-called fall, you find out that they both had a will, but man's will was in agreement with God's will. And up until the point when God said you can't eat of the tree of knowledge, there was no possibility really of a divergence between Adam and Eve's will and God's will. So what happened when they ate of the tree of the knowledge? Well, the Hebrew word for knowledge, which is, let me get strong. Wow, the Hebrew word for knowledge can be. Let's see how this is going. Is it on there? The Hebrew word for knowledge is actually very different to the English word for knowledge. The Hebrew word for knowledge has connotations of actually deciding or creating. It's as if what Adam and Eve gained at the fall was the ability to decide or create for themselves what they thought was good and evil. And that could be very different to what God thought was good and evil. I mean, in proof of this fact, you could go out in the street and take any two individuals and they would not be in absolute agreement about what is good and what is evil. I mean, the whole history of philosophy is all about how different men have come up with different worlds within their minds about what the real world is like and what good is and what bad is. So when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge, they gained the ability that God had, i.e. to create for themselves good and evil. But it wasn't exactly the same as God's ability. It wasn't as strong as his ability. So say, it's really just a shadow of the ability that God had. Where God is omnipotent, i.e. all-powerful, we have power but within limits. Where God is all-knowing, i.e. omniscient, we have knowledge but with limits. So where God creates good and evil, his will is good and evil. It's determined by him. We have a shadow of that. And so when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge, they did actually die, but not a physical death. They died in that they were cut off from the will of God. But this cutting off from the will of God was in the will of God. For it says in Romans, for the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption unto the glorious liberty of the children of God. So here, right at the beginning, you have man being forced into vanity not willingly. So, from when Eve and Adam ate of the tree of knowledge and turned away from God, turned away because God is life and he is love, turned away from love and life, they went into death and they went into hatred. But from that moment on, it became impossible for them to know the true good. And everything that they did, everything you could conceive of for them, was then evil, even if it appeared to be very, very good. Because no man could know the will of God. So everything after that moment that man did was evil. Everything he thought was evil. I mean, this is the whole definition of what sin is. Sin is where we do something we think is good that is not good according to God. So you look at the story of Cain and Abel. What was it that Cain did that was bad? Cain thought that his sacrifice was superior to Abel's. God thought differently. God thought Abel's sacrifice was superior to Cain's sacrifice. And Cain was angry. And when and why do you feel anger? You feel anger when you feel you are wronged. So here Cain exhibits in himself a disagreement with God about what is good and what is evil. And this is the whole summation of what that means. Yes, man had become like God to know good and evil. And that was a horrible thing, because it meant they were cut off from God. Because if they're to know, if we're to create good and evil, we're then not going to be in agreement with God. I mean, this really talks to me, because when I wasn't a believer. I only became a believer 9 months ago, or 10 months ago. But my old argument against God and against it all, it wasn't looking at evolution. I don't know much about that. I've read books by Richard Dawkins, I've read books by Stephen C. Meyer. I've listened to people on both sides of the camp. I personally don't believe in evolution, but that's a side issue. It doesn't really matter. Even if evolution is true, it doesn't change my fundamental beliefs. But my old argument was, okay, I understand, God, that you created everything, that you set up the laws the way they are, because that's the only way that absolutes could actually be absolute, if they were based on the will of God. But I thought to myself, after accepting all of this, isn't it a bit crap? You know, this was me disagreeing with God about good and evil. I thought that the way reality was created, how we had to go away from God to come back to Him, was bad. And why didn't God do it in a different way? I mean, that's the question we all ask. I mean, I'm a universal reconciliationist, and people go, why did God make them go away? Why not just save them straight away? Why not let them? Why not subject them to vanity? Well, the question is still applicable, even if He did do that. The thing is, you then plumb the depths and reach the ground of all possible human understanding when you're asking that why question of God. Why is reality constituted as it is? You've got right to the bottom. And it's here that we, in terms of getting to a real understanding, the truth and the facts, it's here that we have to have utter faith on God and on the will of God. We have to say, even though I may not agree with the will of God, I have to admit that it's good, because on what ground am I standing to disagree with His will? So, in my view, salvation isn't to be saved from some future punishment called hell. It's something very real and very now. Salvation is from your own will. Salvation is from the death that you were in before God brought in the light. Salvation is having the scales taken off your eyes. Okay.